réalité, c'est plus sophistiqué. On met en place des forces de réassurance, c'est-à-dire que...
Avec des soldats français, européens?
Il y a des soldats britanniques, français, turcs qui...
For years, Vladimir Putin warned that certain red lines would bring doomsday consequences if crossed. But as 2025 drew to a close, those lines weren't just crossed, they disappeared entirely. The turning point came when French President Emmanuel Macron announced a new international security mission to be deployed directly inside Ukraine, including Kyiv and Odessa. According to Macron, this mission would be composed of forces from France, the United Kingdom, and Turkey, three of NATO's most capable militaries. Ankara quickly welcomed the proposal, and Turkey's Ministry of National Defense publicly confirmed its readiness to participate. For the Kremlin, the announcement carried heavy implications. If foreign soldiers from NATO member countries were deployed inside Ukraine with a mandate to protect critical infrastructure and government institutions, the nature of the conflict would change overnight. Putin may insist the war continues on Russia's terms, but the strategic reality facing Moscow was shifting dramatically. This mission was not designed as a symbolic peacekeeping gesture. Intelligence assessments indicated that the new security structure would be built specifically to prevent any future Russian offensive capability in Ukraine. High-tech layered defenses, rapid response units, and special forces detachments would be positioned across the country's most sensitive areas, not at the front, but along the logistical and political arteries that keep Ukraine functioning. The first target for deployment, Kyiv and its surrounding region. Here, British and French special forces would act as a deterrent, a tripwire in military terms. Any missile strike or sabotage attempt by Russia against the Ukrainian capital would risk direct confrontation with the militaries of NATO member states. For Moscow, this meant one thing: the prospect of forcing regime change in Kyiv had effectively vanished. The second deployment zone, and the one creating the most anxiety in the Kremlin, was Odessa and the Black Sea coastline. Turkey's involvement made this region particularly sensitive. Unlike other NATO members, Turkey controls the straits and has a long-standing presence in Black Sea security. Under the planned mission, Turkey would take a leading role in ensuring that Ukraine's trade routes remain open and that the grain corridor cannot be used as leverage by Russia. Supported by the Turkish Navy and amphibious forces, the mission in Odessa would confine much of the Russian Black Sea Fleet to its ports. Any attempt by Russia to blockade Odessa or launch an amphibious operation would risk direct engagement with the Turkish Armed Forces, NATO's second-largest military. For Russia, the idea of the Black Sea becoming a contested space again, rather than a controlled environment, represented a major strategic setback. The third layer of the operation focused on Ukraine's critical supply routes connecting its western borders with the country's interior. The United Kingdom outlined a force of 5,000 to 10,000 rotational troops with high readiness levels. London had already allocated over £100 million to build the logistical infrastructure required for this mission. British engineering units, a key component, were tasked with not only supporting troops but also rebuilding and protecting Ukraine's railways and highways to NATO standards. Considering Russia's own railway network was under strain from economic pressure and wartime logistics, a secure and Western-backed supply corridor inside Ukraine threatened to neutralize one of Moscow's most relied-upon strategic advantages. Meanwhile, air policing operations by British and French aircraft would create a de facto no-fly zone over western and central Ukraine. This would severely limit the effectiveness of Russian long-range missile strikes and Iranian-made Shahd drones. Factories, repair facilities, and training centers could operate without constant disruption, turning Ukraine into a 24/7 industrial engine in a war Russia has struggled to sustain. As Europe accelerated the creation of this new multinational mission, another question began circulating among analysts: what happens if the United States reduces or withdraws its support for Ukraine? Some believed it could trigger a collapse. But intelligence assessments suggested a different, and for Russia, far more troubling, outcome. A model similar to what occurred in northern Syria could emerge. When the US pulled back from Syria, many predicted chaos. Instead, Turkey quickly filled the vacuum, establishing a de facto security zone with its own forces, intelligence network, and naval power. In Ukraine, a similar structure could take shape. NATO's European pillar, led by the UK, France, and Turkey, would step in to fill any gap left by Washington. And Turkey's role in particular would become central. Despite public diplomacy, relations between Vladimir Putin and President Recep Tayyip Erdogan have long been shaped by necessity, not trust. Behind the scenes, Turkey has repeatedly demonstrated the ability to counter Russian military capabilities. In Libya, Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drones neutralized Russia's Pantsir air defense systems. In Syria, Turkey used electronic warfare and UAV swarms to overwhelm Russian-backed forces. In the Caucasus, Turkish technology and training helped Azerbaijan change the balance during the Karabakh conflict. These events reshaped Russia's perception of modern warfare, and exposed weaknesses in the systems it once considered its strongest assets. If US intelligence support decreased, British GCHQ and Turkish MIT intelligence services would step in. Europe's two nuclear powers, London and Paris, would operate without US restrictions on the weapons they provide. Long-range missile systems supplied to Ukraine could be used more freely. Airbases deep inside Russia, previously off-limits due to Washington's concerns, could become targets with authorization from the UK, France, and Turkey. Ukraine's defense industry would also shift. Instead of relying on US stockpiles, Ukraine would expand cooperation with Turkish drone producers, integrating systems like the Akinci and future fighter UAV projects into local production capacity. In this scenario, the war wouldn't shrink, it would evolve into a more unpredictable and localized challenge for Moscow. While Russia focuses heavily on the front lines, another challenge has been growing beneath the surface: Crimea. Putin believes the peninsula is fully fortified, protected by air defenses and naval assets. But Crimea contains thousands of residents sympathetic to Ukraine or connected historically to Turkey, the Crimean Tatars. In recent months, sabotage activities across Crimea have increased. Cars belonging to Russian officers destroyed, railway lines damaged, ammunition depots struck by unexplained fires. Many of these incidents have been linked to the Atesh movement, a network involving Ukrainian partisans and Crimean Tatars operating covertly across the peninsula. Turkey plays a quiet but influential role here. The Crimean Tatar community views Turkey as a protective ally, both culturally and historically. Even without US involvement, Turkey's intelligence support could strengthen these networks, making the region increasingly difficult for Russia to control. This pressure is not conventional warfare. It is a strategic challenge from within, one that Russia cannot counter simply with troop deployments or artillery. These networks, combined with diplomatic pressure and Turkey's growing regional influence, could turn Crimea into a destabilizing factor for Moscow. Russian soldiers may be deployed openly on the front lines, but inside Crimea, they face an entirely different kind of threat, one that is harder to track, harder to contain, and virtually impossible to eliminate. As the conflict becomes more dispersed, stretching from Kyiv to Odessa, from supply corridors to the Black Sea, and through hidden resistance inside Crimea, Russia faces a battlefield without clear boundaries. While the military landscape shifts, Russia faces another long-term challenge: the weakening of the geopolitical leverage it once held. For decades, Moscow relied heavily on energy as its primary tool of influence. But this advantage is eroding. According to reports, Turkey has been steadily reducing its dependence on Russian oil, gas, and nuclear energy, a move accelerated by US pressure and the strategic reassessment in Ankara. Turkish refineries began cutting back on Russian crude, redirecting purchases to Iraq, Kazakhstan, and other suppliers. Quietly, Turkey's energy vulnerability to Russia has been shrinking. This shift is significant for one reason: Russia has historically viewed Turkey as both an energy partner and a strategic leverage point. But now, Turkey is positioning itself closer to Western structures, increasingly aligning its long-term interests with the US and Europe rather than Moscow. For the Kremlin, this is a major strategic setback. Energy influence had been one of Putin's most reliable tools, and Turkey's pivot weakens Russia's grip over the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and even parts of the Caucasus. Meanwhile, Russian state media attempted to portray Western interest in negotiations as a diplomatic victory. But later admissions revealed something important. Moscow viewed any peace agreement not as an ending, but as a pause, an opportunity to rebuild, rearm, and try again. Western officials recognized this risk. As a result, the revised peace framework increased Ukraine's allowed military strength from 600,000 to 800,000 soldiers, a clear indication that the West expects future confrontation, regardless of any temporary agreements. Ukraine and its partners are preparing not for the end of war, but for a long-term security restructuring, one that limits Russia's ability to launch future offensives. With Macron's initiative gaining momentum, Turkey strengthening its independence, and Europe preparing for long-term guarantees, Russia's strategic position is shifting more rapidly than at any time in recent memory. The question is no longer whether NATO will formally enter Ukraine, but whether key NATO countries will establish themselves inside Ukraine under new legal frameworks and multinational agreements. For Vladimir Putin, this development represents a direct challenge to the doctrine he has attempted to defend for years. Not through sudden escalation, but through gradual structural changes. 1. Foreign troops deployed inside Ukraine. 2. Air policing missions limiting Russian missile capability. 3. Engineering units rebuilding Ukraine's infrastructure. 4. Intelligence coordination consolidating Western oversight. 5. Regional actors like Turkey undermining Russia's influence in Crimea and the Black Sea. 6. A long-term Ukrainian military force backed by Europe rather than the US alone. Each of these factors reshapes the regional balance, creating a new security environment where Russia's traditional leverage is diminished. The geopolitical map is changing, and not slowly, but decisively. Whether peace talks move forward or stall, the strategic framework surrounding Ukraine is already being rewritten. And with every new deployment, every logistical corridor, every intelligence partnership, the options available to Moscow narrow further. The implications stretch far beyond Ukraine. They reach into the Black Sea, the Middle East, the Caucasus, Europe's security architecture, and even into Russia's own internal stability. For deeper geopolitical breakdowns and clear analysis of global shifts, subscribe to Gearhead Glam, your source for straightforward, high-impact explanations of the world's most important events.